What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Billy here. I got Jake with me, and we've been going under the hood a lot lately on the main show, and we're going to do that again here today. Jake actually, he shot me a text recently that really got this whole thing going, and he basically said that he's been thinking about something recently, calling it ownership projection. As a manager of a player, you inherently believe your player is more valuable than the market thinks, and instantly it hit me. I was like, that's the endowment effect. And we like to talk about dynasty psychology and going under the hood, like I said, all those kind of things. So I wanted to really flesh this thing out. So when I'm talking about the endowment effect, I'm talking about an emotional bias that causes individuals to value an own object higher, often irrationally, than its market value. You see this with items that have emotional or symbolic significance to the individual. You see this with fandom a lot, right? Like if I'm a Patriots fan, I might hold Drake May in higher regard than somebody else, right? So, we take this to Dynasty and we're thinking about everybody, inherently believing their players have more value because they're on their roster. So, Jake, you kind of brought this to me. Where do you want to take this? Do you think that this is kind of an exploitable theory, an exploitable piece of the Dynasty game? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I do. I think I think everything with regards to human psychology is relatively exploitable. But I think the biggest thing is understanding what's creating that impact to the person, right? And so if you can kind of grasp why an individual wants a specific player or owns a specific player already, you can kind of learn a lot more about them. And not to bring up the ever so gracious Tommy Blair, he's an individual who constantly is looking at other managers' behaviors. And I think behaviors are really important. So if you have the opportunity to, even look up an individual and individual owners' ownership numbers, their portfolio ownership numbers of the different players that they own, you can really learn a lot about the ways in which they kind of maneuver. So, you can use products like dynastydaddy.com to look through an individual's sleeper ID and see their entire portfolio for yourself. Hey, I happen to have a player on my team that this guy has 8 shares of, and it consists of 90% of their portfolio. Maybe I can put them into this situation, present them of a player that I think that they already naturally have that endowment effect for a player that I know that they've already kind of valued relatively high because we've already had initial conversations in a trade. And that's kind of how I see the manipulation or taking advantage, the exploitation of the endowment effect. What about yourself?
Yeah, that's really sharp. I like that a lot. I didn't really consider taking it to the Dynasty tools and being, because it's like, first of all, how'd you get a hold of my personal information, sir? You're digging into the sleeper ID. So yeah. It's this really like shady kind of game that you're playing that people don't know. They're grabbing your information, they're looking at it, and they can go attack you. So I think that's super sharp. Knowing somebody wants a player for, the reason of being a fan can provide that edge. I think for me, if I know somebody likes a player a ton, you can offer discounts on players, someone overvalues, and that can get a deal done faster, right? And that's relative to kind of what their value is, right? And what the market value is, and whether you think that is an advantageous move or not, but that knowledge can be helpful in deciding how you want to attack that, right? You can also utilize their want against them in negotiations. You can say, quote, I'm likely to move X player anyway, right? They really, really love Travis Kelce. Like, this is their guy. They're a Chiefs fan. Hey, listen, man, like if you don't want him, that's fine. I'm going to move him anyway in the next week. So you're going to elicit that feeling of ownership being lost, right? And a big part of the endowment effect is ownership, right? That's one of the biggest parts. There's really 2 parts of it. And we'll get into the second part of it in a minute here, but that ownership part is what you really want to tug and pull on, right? Because once they feel that's being lost, then they're going to feel like, man, I need to go after this. I need to really maybe do something that I shouldn't be doing, or that's not in my best interest, to go out and get this player. So I also think the more often that, when you find out, somebody really, really wants a guy or whatever, and you're also trying to get off of them maybe quickly, the more often that they're discussed in the league chats. You see, posts on Twitter hyping them up, you pop that in the league chat. Hey, you see this, not really, you're not going in their DMs and like harassing them, but you're just kind of putting this out into the air right? And it's getting that ownership kind of feeling going. And I think that these are all things that you can really utilize in specific situations. This is obviously not something you want to do all the time necessarily, but I think, thinking of myself, like when I'm really trying to get off of a player, I think this would be helpful if I were to know that, there's a manager or two in my league that are fans of this team. Oh, there's some buzz going around. Maybe I can, use this to my advantage. What do you think about those thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I almost use this like side of logic in the same sense of thinking of like garage sales, estate sales. You go in to someone's home, you're dealing with, an older person who's held on to this, puzzle that they think is worth $50 and it's really worth 25. But you start having these conversations about trying to get the price lower. And then in your mind, you're like, oh, what if I just replace this item with like a new puzzle for them? Is that going to necessarily replace that endowment effect for them? I don't think it does. And I think it's really important that when we're having these negotiations with other managers, that you're not trying to replace one for one the same feeling of a player.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, you're trying to go for that other emotional connection that they have to another player. And when I say that, I'm thinking of like, you don't want to send a similar style player in return thinking like, oh, that will kind of suffice their need, their want for that player. I just don't think that necessarily works because typically, to the point, is when you own that first player, that's the one that you have the endowment effect towards, right? Like that's the player that you don't want to give up. And that's kind of the way that I try and maneuver around it.
Yeah, and there's something specific. It may be something, very, very subjective about that player that that person likes, that is unique to that player and that other profile doesn't possess. So to your point, you can't really go that route necessarily. So, the endowment effect is an economics term which kind of works with Dynasty because it's market economics essentially is what we're working with here. And so, when thinking about trying to overcome this, because I think, we're talking about it. So, maybe people think you know, there's no way that this can impact us. We're immune to this. That's not true. Definitely not true. But to overcome the endowment effect, I think you have to have a really clear investment strategy with a plan to sell the specific investments or to move the specific investments or some plan with the assets that you're acquiring that you have, right? So, if you are a fan of Drake May or the Patriots, let's say, and you also happen to have fallen into a Drake May share, admit to yourself that you're going to have some bias, that you're going to probably hold on to him a little tighter than you should, and try to mitigate that. When you get offers that are fair, don't just hold on to him because he's your player. You know what I mean? It's easier said than done, I will say that. But I do think that it is fairly simple, right? You're trying to negate bias, inherent bias that you have. You just have to first admit it, notice it, and then I think you can kind of mitigate the effects of it. So one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of avoiding the bias, and that's very closely tied, is loss aversion, right? And that's same thing in behavioral economics. It refers to a phenomenon where a real or potential loss is perceived by individuals as psychologically or emotionally more severe than an equivalent gain. For instance, the pain of losing $100 is often far greater than the joy gained in finding the same amount. And the joy of winning a trade doesn't feel as good as the bad of losing a trade, right? So that's kind of what we're getting at here. And I think that is something that impacts me constantly. I don't want to lose a trade. I just lost a trade recently in Jake's eyes, and it made me feel terrible, right? And I feel good about the trade, but just the outward appearance of losing a trade doesn't feel good, and you don't want to live in that space. Now, it's okay to live in that space, and a lot of the times you'll be right. You won't always be wrong, and the other people won't always be right. So, it's okay to live in uncomfortable spaces. And honestly, you hear all the time, most of the times, that's where people thrive. Get uncomfortable, okay? Get uncomfortable and try not to, sink in that loss aversion. You don't want to sit in that. You don't want to think about that all the time. It's really a hard thing to avoid. Do you really struggle with that, Jake, or is that something that you don't think about often?
No, it is something I think about often, but I don't know if I necessarily struggle with it because I like to think of the endowment effect on like the antithesis. Like I want to have the anti-endowment effect, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
my logic with regards to any investment is with the idea that I'm owning some piece of asset that I think is going to be able to fluctuate in value no matter what. And I own things I don't like. I, if you can see behind me, I own a lot of records that I probably should not have bought. But like the reality is that when
I
I
hate this Xbox behind me too.
yeah, I
No.
fucking don't use it enough, you know? But but like the reality is that when I think of a player, and I'm just going to use this as like a very prime example because it's the first thing that came to mind. I acquired last year Isaiah Pacheco. I think Isaiah Pacheco is a fine dynasty asset. I'm notoriously low on running backs. I thought I could acquire him at a relatively decent cost. Sent Roshan Johnson and a third for him. And then I packaged him into a deal, not even 6 months later to basically tier up from the 109 to the 104. Like that's the kind of way in which I think we should be viewing assets instead of being so emotionally connected to them because, hey, I won that trade. I got significantly more value from
Mhm.
it. Like I need to know that I can take a potential value loss on what his market value is right now. That's okay because I know that I'm gaining the exponentially more valuable piece at the 104. And that's kind of my anti-endowment effect in my head, where I'm kind of detaching myself from those biases by explaining to myself that, like, at the end of the day, I really just want to be acquiring pieces that I know I can continue to move. And when you start acquiring non-liquid assets, that's kind of when you start finding yourself stuck. And I think actually having more of an endowment effect because no one else can kind of hone in on them. So then you're asking for thirds or even fourths for players that should probably be cut. And the reality is that they're useless. And so, so many people have tons of trinkets in their homes, lots of tchotchkes. At the end of the day, that's kind of what your dynasty roster will look like if you kind of get stuck in this endowment effect ideology.
Yeah, wow, that's such a great dismount as always on that because, it really kind of leans back to what you and I just recorded, and it'll probably come out before this one, talking about, these three players that may be finished and talking about buying these risky, profiles. And everything you just said made me think back to that and why we want to avoid that, right? And kind of fall. And I think the people who do buy into those profiles more often than not probably are leaning into that endowment effect ideology. So that's just super interesting stuff. I love where we always take things. I want to finish off here real quick with some dynasty examples, current events that we've been talking about that have happened personally to me, and then kind of something we're seeing in the market that I think will wrap this up pretty nicely. So I've been trying to move Brock Purdy. I acquired him trading away Tyreek Hill, and the deal that basically has been out there in this league where I've been trying to get a little younger, these are just moves I feel like I need to make. I don't want to explain too much, but I was trying to move over to JJ McCarthy plus, which feels like a win just automatically on it because I think those two guys are similar tiered players, but I've just been hesitant because of that loss aversion, right? I don't want to be wrong on JJ, right? If I'm wrong on JJ McCarthy, screwed. And I don't want to be left holding that bag, but I also don't want to look stupid when the plus isn't enough. So, just kind of talking about this whole thing. I made this deal. I ended up making this deal. I pushed through it. I thought about it really long and hard, and I was fighting literally through this whole. And I realized it when Jake and I were talking about doing this. I was like, it's the fear. It's the fear, and it's the more fun side. JJ plus Stevenson and Gus Edwards for Brock Purdy and Darnell Mooney. Boom, right? Like that's an obvious win. It just is. It's an obvious win. You got to take it. So that's kind of where things took me when I was thinking that through. Also, I thought about my just unstoppable love for Mark Andrews, right? I inherently will hold on to him probably too long in Dynasty, most likely, because I just think that the market is always too low on him. Will there come a day where I guess, the gap closes and I say, okay, enough is enough. I can move off of him, maybe. But that's just one I know that I have that inherent player bias. It's not even a team bias. I just love this guy. So that's when that hit me in this final one. We were talking in the Dynasty Underdog chat today, and it kind of organically came up, right? Thinking about Evan Ingram, he's sitting at tight end 12, 91 overall ADP, and the chat's talking about how is he undervalued, right? Is this guy undervalued? And I'm like, feels like his startup value might be cheaper than his market value in trades, because is anyone trading him away for that kind of value for like a early second for a Derrick Henry or Ramondre Stevenson? It's a 29-year-old tight end who's had a really good season, though, or couple seasons. That's the range he's going for ADP. But startup value versus post startup value is kind of an interesting convo when you bring it back to the endowment effect, because once you actually roster the asset, it holds more value to that person, right? And I'm sure it ranges from person to person, but if you get somebody who loves Evan Ingram, I mean, you're screwed, right? Like you're not getting the trade done. So it's just that you kind of see it happen as soon as you take ownership of a player, and also, team build, all that stuff, strategy comes into play after the startup. But I think the idea of owning that player, rostering that player, takes effect instantly after the startup. And there's almost a premium placed on the player's price because of that. Have you seen that, do you think?
Yeah, and we've been having this conversation, but I think even more so because we're still kind of in the rookie draft window.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great time to kind of think about it. Acquisition cost is so important, and people always hone in on like, go get your guy, go get your guy. You got to go get your guy, man. And the reality is that when you over acquire your asset, and when I say that, you acquire that asset way too early, that means that if for whatever reason your guy ain't your guy anymore, you have truly fucked up their value. Excuse my language. But like, you've put yourself into a box that have made you a loser. And if that's what you want to be, you get stuck in your endowment effect, Like that's such a sad reality. But like it maddens me. Don't do that. Like, don't do that. Don't add value onto players that you don't need to. And that goes with also acquiring them. Like, I just don't believe in over acquiring an asset for any particular reason. There's not a singular asset that is going to make your team exponentially better. There are always going to be other players within that tier that you'll be able to get for cheaper. And I really just want to hone in on that. The anti-endowment effect, in my opinion, which is really what we should be driving here to get further away from the endowment effect as a player, is to make sure that you are acquiring players at an adjustable cost so that when you need to sell at any given time, it makes appropriate sense. That doesn't mean you're going to win every single trade or you're going to lose every single trade. You're going to find some middle ground where you can find yourself value on both sides. And that's really what's most important, because when you add this adjusted value for no apparent reason, guess what? You're going to get stuck to your acquisition cost until you get let go. And, we've had this conversation on the DU trade archives as well. Billy did a fantastic job kind of giving up on an over-acquired asset like Justin Fields and put himself in a much better position, 2 years further down the line, but he got out of it. But you know how he put himself in that position first? He over-acquired. He paid way too much for an asset that he didn't need to, and he found himself in a much better position a few years later. And that really just comes down to the individual player. So we want to protect you from those situations. We want to protect you from making those types of decisions.
Awesome. I really think that's going to wrap it up. We covered what the endowment effect is, covered how to exploit it with your league mates, avoiding that bias yourself, talked about some dynasty examples, some current events. I think we really did a thorough job here talking about the endowment effect and its impact in the dynasty landscape. So we really appreciate everybody joining, everybody tuning in. Jake, thank you so much as always. You absolutely crushed this. Everybody, please like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Peace out.